Have you tried using script tasks, but you're not sure whether to use the process task runner or the Docker task runner? Well, I'm going to show you the difference to help you decide which one's best for your use case. Inside of Kestra, when you use a script task, by default, it's going to use the Docker task runner, which means it's going to put your code inside of a Docker container and execute it inside of there. This has a number of benefits, but you might also be interested in running it as a process, where it will run it as a sub-process on the Kestra host. Now, I'm going to show you an example of what the process looks like, and then give you a few examples of where you might want to use this and where it might not work so well. To add the task runner for process, all I need to do is add the task runner property and specify the type here as a process. Now, when I run this, we will see that it's going to run as a sub-process on the Kestra host. Now, the benefit here is, because it's not in a container, it doesn't have to pull any images, it hasn't got to spin up the container, it can run the code straight away. So this is really good if you only want to run a couple of lines of code and you want it to be quick without having to build the whole container just to run a simple script. For example, this script here isn't doing anything particularly dramatic, so if I was to execute this right now, we'll see that it will run quite quickly. However, we will run into one problem, which is that when it tries to run, there is no dependency for pandas. As you can see here, no module named pandas. So what can I do to resolve that by using a sub-process? Now I can add the before commands property like so, and in here I can simply add a pip install like I would on my local machine to install pandas like this. Now this has some benefits because this allows me to install pandas really quickly. I don't have to spin up a container to do this, and just like that, as you can see, I've installed pandas and I've got a certain version here that's going to use 2.2.3. Now it's going to have to take some time to download it for the first time, but what you will notice is if I create a separate workflow in a minute, because I've installed it on the sub-process, there isn't any isolation. So it means other workflows can use that already installed pandas library. Perhaps that's a benefit to you. You've got all of your code using the same module versions, so this could be quite beneficial to you. But if you've got different workflows depending on specific versions, then you might run into dependency clashes, which is no good for anyone. Now you can actually see that this is actually finished with a warning because I've installed this directly on the system rather than using something like a virtual environment like it suggested. Now we can also add a virtual environment too using before commands so that we can get the benefit of some isolation without having to use a full Docker container. So let's do that. This quick workflow is going to quickly show us the dependencies that we have on our system. As you'll see here, I'm just doing a simple pip list, which is going to list out all of the different things installed for Python. So we can see that we've got the Kestra library, pandas is installed, and so on. So we've got a bunch of different things here. Now, as you can see, pandas is installed here with 2.2.3. I can now install other things here and then access those in different flows. Now, using before commands, I've now added a virtual environment where I've created it here with the first command and then I've activated it. Now, it's worth noting that depending on where you're running Kestra, I'm running it on a Mac, which is on a Unix environment. So it's expecting me here to run these as Unix commands. But if you're running this on Windows and you're not running it inside of Docker, then you will probably need to be using the Windows commands, which is such as script/activate. A little bit different, but it's definitely worth knowing the differences between those two. If you're running it inside of Docker, it's going to want this sort of method. So if you followed the tutorial on the website and you're not using the standard jar, this should work for you. Now, when I execute this, we'll see that I'm going to add a little pip list here at the end so we can see the dependencies inside of this one versus what we saw in our previous flow. So when I execute this now, we won't get that warning because we've installed things in a virtual environment. We haven't got that issue of installing things not as root. And you'll see here that it's created my virtual environment. It's installing pandas inside of it. And we can see that it's got any other dependencies it needs. And we can actually see here that we've got different dependencies inside of that virtual environment, but the key thing is there's things missing that we had on the sub-process, such as Kestra. The Kestra library is no longer here. So this is quite a good way of being able to make sure that those dependencies are isolated without having to deal with a Docker container. But there are definitely some benefits to using a Docker container. So let's have a look at those. So here I'm using a Docker task runner now. Now, the key thing here is I'm able to install pandas just using before commands like previously, but I don't need to worry about a virtual environment because the Docker container itself is providing that virtual environment by isolating from everything else on the system. So when I press execute now, we'll see that it's going to install pandas inside the container. It's going to be able to run the code as expected, and we won't see any warnings. But the key difference here is it is now going to have to pull a Docker image, which you can see the default one here is Kestra Pi, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it does take a little bit longer, but once it's set up, it's really quick. And if I run this again, that Docker container has already been set up with the image. The image is ready and cached, so it doesn't have to pull it again, unless there has been any changes. And you can obviously change the pull policy too if you want it to pull every time to suit your needs. So we can see here, it was much quicker at being able to download the dependencies, and we'll see it's going to be able to just get that output a little bit quicker than last time. And as we can see there, it was about 5 seconds quicker than the previous execution, to show that it does cache and therefore it can speed things up. But if I was to go back to that process one and look at executions, we'll see that on average, it was about the same with a virtual environment. But without the virtual environment, it's dramatically quicker. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Now, this is the benefit of using a Docker container. We can specify a container image for our container to use that already has these dependencies pre-installed. As part of pulling that image from a registry, we don't then need to use before commands to install dependencies inside of it, which then gives us the benefit of being able to speed things up, but also make sure that image has everything we need exactly how we would like. So here I can now get rid of before commands, and instead I'm going to type in container image. Now by default it uses Kestra Pi, which includes a few standard Python libraries, but we actually want to look at, I've actually changed my container image here to use PyData, which includes pandas as default, so I don't need to install it using before commands. So when I press execute now, we'll see that it's going to be able to pull that container pretty quickly. The image will get pre-installed with pandas, and then I can just run the container. So this will run a little bit quicker than what we were doing previously. As we can see here, it's pulled that image really quickly, and it didn't need to run any before commands. So now when I go to overview, we can see that it only took 4 seconds, which is pretty quick compared to when we were doing it in about 12 seconds, having to then run pip install on top of using the container. So we get the benefit here of being able to use a Docker container to isolate all our dependencies. We can pull the dependencies we need as part of a pre-packaged image, and then we can just run that in a container. So if you're looking to run your scripts on Kestra, I definitely recommend going down the Docker route over process, as you get the benefits of isolation, but also efficiency at the same time. But there are definitely use cases where using a process task runner, such as accessing files on your local machine, or being able to use dependencies between flows, then it's definitely a better option. Hopefully you found that useful and you're going to be able to start using the task runners inside of Kestra. Let us know if you've got any questions in the comments below. We'd love to be able to hear your feedback.